So it's my pleasure today to welcome you at the lecture of Eszter Spät. So she specializes in the religious minorities of the Middle East, and the focus of her research is on the Yezidi religious oral tradition and its scriptualization. So what she will present today. And she is also interested in the role of religion in Yezidi identity formation in modern Iraq. She has been carrying out regular fieldwork in northern Iraq since 2002, and she also worked there as a war correspondent. And she is currently a visiting professor at the Central European University, Budapest, Vienna, and she earned a PhD in medieval studies from CU in 2009 with a thesis on the late antique roots of Yezidi oral tradition. Eszter has received numerous grants from the Hungarian Scientific and Research Fund, HOTK, the Gerda Henkel Foundation, and the Fritz Thyssen Foundation. And she has also held numerous research and visiting positions, including at the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg Dynamics in the History of Religions, Ruhr University Bochum. She was a visiting fellow at the Centrum Moderner Orient in Berlin and a visiting scholar at the University of Heidelberg in the Ritual Dynamics program, and also guest professor at the Otto Friedrich University Bamberg in the master's program Cultural Studies of the Middle East. She has published numerous journal articles and book chapters, and also 2 books with the titles The Yezidis, published with Saki Books in 2005, and Late Antique Motifs in Yezidi Oral Tradition, published with Gorgias Press in 2010. And finally, she made the anthropological documentary titled Following the Peacock in 2013. So, Eszter, I'm very excited to hear your talk today, and the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you, Lily. So today's topic is written word in Yazidi oral tradition, bookish techniques of prognostication as sources of esoteric knowledge among the Yazidis. However, before I get into these bookish details, I think I had better say a few words about Yazidis themselves, as they are generally not a very well-known group of people. So first is that Yazidis follow their own religion. Yazidi religion. I mention this because quite often I get the question whether they are Muslims or Christians. So no, they are not. They have their own religion, though we will get back to this question that not everybody accepts this as a genuine religion. Most of them are Kurdish speakers with a very few exceptions. So they are Arabic speakers, and we are not quite sure about the exact number, but there are about 500,000 Yazidis, give or take. So, of course, nobody is quite counting them. There used to be Yazidi communities in south and eastern Turkey, but those no longer remain there. They are practically all of them now living in the Western diaspora. There were 2 smaller communities of Yazidis in Syria. We are not sure what happened to them, unfortunately. There are still several 10,000 Yazidis in Armenia and Georgia. There is now a huge community in the Western diaspora, especially in Germany. However, most Yazidis, and this is the center of their community, live in northern Iraq. So this is the historical center and the biggest community. In Iraq, there are 2 distinct Yazidi communities, one living east of the river Tigris in what is basically Kurdistan. This is also referred to as Walat or homeland because this is a land of origin probably for Yazidis. And the other communities living on and around Mount Sinjar, near the Syrian border. And I have to emphasize that they are talking about two communities because even though naturally they share a lot of features and characteristics, they developed in their own distinct way, and they do have some distinct traditions, and this includes actually the practice of divination, where there are quite interesting differences. Another question that people often ask me is about the origin of Yezidis. So this question is, of course, rather hard to answer because we do not have any written historical sources regarding their origins, and also because it is an oral religion and an oral culture. I shall return to this. There is really no cut-off point in this case where we can say that this is where it started. Yezidis themselves say that it is an ancient religion, the most ancient of all religions, in fact. Academics, however, when they talk about religion as, so Yezidi religion as an institutionalized one or possessing institutions, they point to a 12th century Sufi order. So Sufism, the mystical movement within Islam, it was already mentioned by Shobana a month ago, and I think Tommaso also talked about it last semester, and Lily will return to it later on. 12th century was a heyday of popular Sufi orders. This is when Al-Adawiyya was founded by Sheikh Adi bin Musafir, who is today a central figure in Yazidi mythology. He is a kind of incarnated divine essence. However, researchers have found that he was a real historical person as well, and his writings survive, which shows that he was a Sufi, but also quite an Orthodox Sunni, and his writings do not show any heretical thoughts. However, after his death, the Sufi order founded by him slowly transformed, and it absorbed more and more elements from its local environment. In Yazidi religion, as we know it today, we will find a lot of motifs which come from pre-Islamic religious substrata, so motifs from Western Iranian religious thought, ancient Western Iranian, then from Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, Manichaeism, Christianity, and so on. Naturally, as this process took place, then step by step, so Yazidi religion ceased to be a part of Islam and became something different. I think it also may be worth mentioning that it is a kind of monotheism, depending on how we define monotheism. So Yezidis believe that God or Godhead is the origin of everything, but at the same time, they also teach that there are 7 holy angels who emanated from the essence or light of God. And in turn, this holy, the essence, divine essence of these holy angels then incarnated or become manifest in human form on earth from time to time as Yezidi leaders. So one example is Sheikh Adi, whom I already mentioned, whose essence is basically the same than the essence of God, according to Yazidi sacred text, and the essence of the peacock angel, the leader of the 7 holy angels and protector of the Yazidis, who you can see his symbol right side. Basically came to the attention of a global audience and became known in 2014 when they were attacked by the Islamic State and thousands were massacred and thousands were taken captive. For those who followed the events, you may remember that this was not the way Christians of the region were treated. So Christians were allowed to flee, admittedly without their possessions, so only with what they could carry, but still they fared better. And the reason for this is that Christians were considered by the Islamic State what we call people of the book. So they were seen as people with a real revered religion, possessing a sacred book, as opposed to Yezidis who, and ISIS wrote this down in their periodical actually, that either kafirs or pagans or heretics, which doesn't really matter because both should be treated the same. They should enjoy absolutely no protection and they have no real religion. Therefore, this is how they should be treated. And this is not the first time that Yezidis experience this kind of discrimination is a stupid word, but that they are not a people of the book and therefore they can be freely persecuted and enjoy absolutely no protection under Islamic law. And the reason for this is, as I have already mentioned, that we are talking about an oral religion. That is, traditionally, they possess no written sacred books. Instead, religious knowledge and religious texts were transmitted orally by specialists or experts, such as you can see in the picture. In fact, even writing down sacred text was traditionally banned by religion, and by extension, reading and writing also came to be considered taboos, except for one single priestly lineage, whom I will mention later on. So, not possessing books, it's not a novel problem for Yezidis. It was already a problem when the region belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and they lived through several persecutions because of this. The situation is, in this sense, better in the state of Iraq because it is officially accepted as a religion. It gets written in the identity papers. However, official recognition notwithstanding, many people still feel that it's not a real religion. So when I was doing my fieldwork and people asked me, Muslims and Christians, what I was doing, and I said, I'm researching the religion of Yezidis, quite often the answer was like, what religion of Yezidis? They don't have religion, they don't have books. So, as you can see, this is an ongoing problem for the community, not just because of persecutions, which cease from time to time, but also because the social stigma is constantly there. Through the centuries, Yezidis tried to develop various strategies to compensate for this lack of written sacred books. So the first one, I would call this the traditionalist view. It's simply that Yezidi sacred texts, so that's most often those are the CAS or hymns, are equal to the written revealed books. In this tradition, CAS are considered the word of God. In fact, in Arabic, I think qawl actually means something like word or speaking. So they are word of God and the manifestation on earth of ʿilmi, batinî, or divine esoteric knowledge. And here I have to stop for a moment to talk about our favorite topic, how to translate batinî into English and what to do with esoteric. So in Islam and what I would call Islamicate cultures, batinî refers to the inner spiritual or esoteric aspects of faith and reality, while zahir refers to the external aspects. And Yezidi researchers themselves usually translate ʿilmi, batinî and related word as esoteric knowledge into English because this is an accepted translation. However, I don't quite feel comfortable about it because I think that esoteric carries a very different connotation in this cultural context than it carries in the West. At least in Hungarian, it's a rather negative word, and I wouldn't really like to employ it, even if that's anathema here. So I think I usually prefer, and this is what I'm going to do, to translate batin and batinî. Yezidis use both spiritual, heavenly, divine, or supernatural, depending on the context, because for me that's nearer to the way they employ this expression. So after esoteric, or translation of esoteric, returning to the question of hymns, to quote the words of a Yezidi religious specialist who is actually living in Stuttgart, he said on a video posted on Facebook, young people ask, where are our sacred books? And I answer, Christians have the Injil, the Gospels, and we have how many hymns we have? Are not these hymns our sacred book? They are true religious knowledge with God as its source. He's, of course, in many ways right, because when we think, for example, of the Quran, it was an oral revelation, which was just written down after a certain point. But most people are not quite aware of this, and this answer does not really satisfy most people, especially these days, but also in the past, it was not really enough. So other strategies have to be found. And this is one which is really going on today, what I call the scripturalization of Yezidi oral tradition or religious oral tradition. It goes back to the 70s when the ban to write down sacred texts was first lifted by Yezidi religious leaders, and they started writing them down. And it has really gained momentum as school education and general literacy spread among Yezidis. This means much more than just finding a new vehicle for transmitting religious knowledge. Scripturalization is really just transforming the content and nature of Yezidi religion. So content changes because of the selection and deselection process. They are also creating a rather rigid body of doctrinal teachings, which is very alien to oral traditions and so on. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, which I worked on in details. Now I really don't have the time, unfortunately, to go into it, but I have to mention it because it's kind of a part of what I am going to talk about, so it gives a context. Before the spread of literacy and the onset of scripturization, there was another way for creating books, and for the want of better expression, I'm calling this the creation of the strategic concept of sacred book, or perhaps imagining the book. And this basically means that Yezidis claimed and still claim that there exists a Yezidi book, or sometimes Yezidi books, which, however, cannot be seen either because it's very well hidden from prying eyes. And it's not only hidden, so nobody would see it, but even seeing it could be dangerous because something horrible could happen to people if it were seen. Or this book had been stolen by the enemy, or it was destroyed by the enemy, or even by Yezidis themselves who wanted to prevent the enemy getting hold of it. So these reports about the existence of Yezidi sacred books, which however could not be accessed for various reasons, this go back at least to the first half of the 19th century. It's possible that they are older than that, but this is when we get the first report. So this is a post-quam date. And it must be noted that in this case, sacred book exist as a singular sacred object. So it's not like, for example, the Quran or the Bible, where the content may be revealed, but physical copies exist in handmade or human-made and exist in any number and are used for transmission of knowledge and in order to prevent forgetting. So this is not the function of the Yezidi sacred book, and it's not imagined as such. Instead, it's seen as an object of sacred object of proof, proving so that it's a real religion, and of power. And so it's also believed to have a special power, not just like, if somebody sees it and horrible things would happen, but it also contains a kind of special revealed knowledge, which is not accessible in any other way. And there are many stories about this, which are also connected with the idea of the stolen sacred book. So I heard several times that scientific development in the West can be connected to the stolen Yezidi book. Here is a quotation from the late Baba Sheikh, the religious head of the community, who told a journalist about the alleged Yezidi book that it is now in Britain. They took our book. It's a bit of an anti-colonial discourse there. That is why the British have science and education. The book came from the sky. If you go to the British Museum, you can see it. So that's also a very interesting remark, that it can be seen in the British Museum. And the explanation from that, apart from they are being reached by the ongoing repatriation discourse, is that all this talk about a secret Yezidi sacred book really excited travelers in the late 19th century. So this is a time when Europeans or Westerners realized that other religions may also have sacred books, not just Christianity. And in turn, and they felt that all religions must have a sacred book, and they were really looking for the sacred book of the Yezidis because they couldn't exist without a sacred book. And as a result to this interest, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, manuscripts started appearing on the market in the Middle East, in what is today's Iraq, which allegedly contained the Yazidi sacred books, specifically two books, the Black Book, Mesafiresh, and the Al-Jiwa, the Book of Radiation or Illumination. And this was quite a sensation at the time. They got translated, published, even though people were saying that these are very strange for sacred books, and they were not very happy about them. And of course, it was realized by academics that the reason is that these were forgeries. The manuscripts were forgeries. They contained genuine Yazidi oral tradition, sure, but they were not written down by Yazidis. They were written down by outsiders, probably by or several Christians who were familiar with Yazidis. And they were only a small section of the whole oral body transmitted by Yazidis. So we are talking about physically, these are forgeries. And of course, they are not sacred books in the sense that we refer to as sacred book. However, there was a kind of feedback to the community, especially after spread of literacy, because Yazidis could have access to the printed books. And actually, I saw several of them being sold in book fairs and by the roadside and so on. And now part of them are also, circulating on internet. And as a result, these sacred books became incorporated into Yazidi mythology, so to speak. So a lot of simply people, many of them who may not even be able to read and write, really believe that these books do exist somewhere. And they talk about how someone saw them or it in a museum or in a library. A friend even told me that his students wanted to petition the British Library to give it back, and so on. Right. So on Facebook, for example, I like looking at Yazidi pages, and quite often I see the Yazidi sacred books that somebody somehow made up, but then everybody sees this. There's a peacock, so it must be Yazidi. This one is a Jilwa. It's actually, I found this recently, it's a whole video showing the Jilwa or Book of Radiation page by page. Very interesting. I have no idea who created this. It has secret ancient Yazidi writing and all kind of pictures. And under it, you can see the image of its alleged author, Angel Sheikh, one of the 7 holy angels who incarnated as Sheikh Hassan. He is known as the Lord of the Pen, and of course, the author or revealer of this book, depending on one's way of thinking, and the ancestor of the Sheikhly lineage of the Sheikhs of Sheikh Hassan, who were the only people who were allowed to read and write. And this is actually where we enter the field of divination. That's why I had to mention it. It's with the Jilwa. Because when I was doing my fieldwork, some young people told me that, we do have a sacred book, and no, it's not hidden, it's not stolen. You can go and see it with certain Sheikh families. And yep, they were right. So the book you see there, it's a manuscript, and it does have Al-Jiwa written on top. So actually people who are more traditionalists, so that is all the older people, as well as most of the owners of the book, refer to it as Book of Angel Sheikh. So that was a guy in the previous glory around his head. And this book is, in the possession of about 4 or 6 families descended from Sheikh Hassan. I spoke with 3 families and know for sure about 1 more family. 2 more maybe exist or don't exist. This is not always quite clear with Yezidis. So this book is actually there. And when it comes to what its owners say about its origins and the way it's utilized, it depends somewhat on their educational and social background of the owners. So in the families which are more educated and belong to the now emerging Yazidi middle class, they claim that this is not identical with the Jilwa, the Yazidi sacred book, because that one, written by Sheikh Hassan, that was lost over the ages. This is just a small portion of the original book, which was memorized and handed down orally through the ages. And then at one point, probably recently, it got written down. Now, in those families which are more traditionalist and less belonging to this kind of modern social class, they claim that, yes, this is the original book written or revealed. So it was not written, it was revealed by Sheikh Hassan or taken out of his pocket or something like that. And no change has been made of it to it, even though, of course, the copies are more recent. In either case, it doesn't get used as a sacred book, again, in the sense we mean it. So it's not used for transmission of knowledge. It's not read from aloud. Instead, it's just used for healing, divination, and for creating amulets. It's very interesting to look at the way activities connected to the Book of Angel Sheikh are described or expressed. So what people say is, they don't say, I went for divination. They say, I couldn't have children, so I went to this Sheikh, and he opened the Book of Angel Sheikh for me. So it's opening the book. And for creating amulet, they say, I couldn't have children, but then he made my book, or created my book, and I was wearing it, and that helped. So in that case, creating my book, that refers to making an amulet, which is different from what is usually used for amulets. There are differences between the way the more and less educated utilize the book. So in the middle class families, I didn't look inside the book, but my colleague did, and she said that it contains Arabic and Kurdish prayers. And also that I also saw that on the first two pages, it also have two charts showing the symbols of prophets and Yezidi holy beings. And the client has to put their finger on this chart, which can only be interpreted by the owners of the book, who then knows the fate of the client. And on the basis of this, they tell them which holy being to go to and choose the right prayer or prayers from the book. And then very carefully copy out that prayer, which then they can wear as an amulet. And this is very much like the books of protection, which are handbooks for creating amulets used by Syriac or Aramaic-speaking Christians in the same region, and also very much, especially the charts, are very much like what we find in Islamic magical manuscripts. There are a lot of similarities in the way the more traditional people use the book, but there were also some striking differences. So they also say opening the book, but don't really open it. What happens that it's always kept open on the same page, which shows a chart of Arabic characters or letters. The client also has to touch them and sometimes tell the name of his or her mother, which is traditionally used in magic in the Middle East for creating amulets. So it's part of numerological calculations, which were not done here. So it was just usual step by step of asking mother's name, but it was not really used. But what was really interesting is that after this, Sheikh did not move any of the pages of the book, left it open, looked up in the sky, and then made some divination, like what was the reason for a person's trouble, and also wrote out an amulet without consulting the book. And I say wrote, but for those who can read Arabic, but maybe other people can also see that this is not writing. This is scribbling. So it's non-readable. It was just like this. And I have to mention that person opening the book, I checked, he was literate. There are at least two families who use this book in this way. And obviously, I couldn't ask, why are you scribbling instead of writing? But putting the different information I got, so I could put it together, that in this case, the power of opening the book lies not in the text itself, not in the words of the text. It's more about magical act of writing or inspired act of writing in the presence of a sacred object, which also comes somehow from a spiritual being. So in this case, it's a sacred book from a holy being, which channels the direct revelation from the spiritual or batinî world to the Sheikh. And this concept that there can be direct revelation from the spiritual world to a human being is not is not confined just to the Book of Angel Sheikh. It can also be found in the case of Yezidi seers, because they work on the basis of these. So seers are people who can communicate with the divine or supernatural realm directly. Their activities include healing, doing divination for personal problems, providing moral instructions to the community, prognostications about usually an apocalyptic future, and so on. Yezidi seers seem to disappear by the end of the 20th century, so their numbers were dropping and the remaining ones were mostly working in hiding, and everybody thought they would disappear. But after the fall of the Saddam system, there was a sudden explosion of Yezidi seers, or a renaissance, so there are now a lot of them around. And one could talk about seers from many different aspects, like their disappearance, reappearance, what they are being consulted about and how that reflects the changing problems of a transforming community, about the struggle between religious establishment and the subaltern which they represent. But what concerns me here is the Bookish language or language of book, which is used to describe seers' activities and how these are concepted to the concept of divine revelation and an oral written book, so to speak. So again, we are talking about two different regions, which really counts now, because in Sinjar, near the Syrian border, seers get their power from the jinns. So they have jinn servants. That's how they are able to do things. It's very different east of the Tigris, where seers have dalil, that literally can mean proof or guide. So I am translating that as spiritual guide. And what exactly a dalil is, it's not easy to define. So it's also called hudan, honor, indicating that it's in this case, it's not the dalil who serves the seer, but it's the other way around. The seer works as a mouthpiece for the spiritual guide. It's their honor. So Yezidis compare dalils of guides to, they say, they're angels or like Yezidi holy beings, but most often they call them batinî, that is an entity from the batin, the spiritual or esoteric world. So to quote one seer, all my knowledge, everything I say comes from my guide, from the batin world. I will talk with you, but whatever knowledge I can give is given by my dalil, not by me. I can only say what my guide gives me. And I also want to quote the words of a professor of mathematics who said in English, a seer is someone who is talking with beings not from this world, but from the other world, the invisible world. So seers usually have basically two activities. One is to look, which is to when their clients go to them for divination with their problems. It doesn't interest us now, even though it's very exciting. But the one I want to talk about is falling into book, which is a very curious expression. And it's used to describe a state of trance or state of altered consciousness, at a state of consciousness, when the the seer is speaking with their spiritual guide, or rather it's a spiritual guide talking through the seer. And the Yezidis say there are no two seers who are the same and not two books which are the same. So it would take very long to really describe what this looks like. But I will mention only one feature which all share. In fact, they say that these are synonyms. So falling into book is seen as a synonym of speaking tongues. Because this is what they do in trance or in book. They speak in tongues, so they practice glossolalia. And the Kurdish expression is the same, to speak tongues. So they speak languages unknown to the seer, like German, Chinese, whatever, as well as they speak the language of the angels. And in between, they also speak some Kurdish, so that's when they give prophetical statements and moral instructions and so on. And this state may be, falling into book, may be spontaneous due to some triggers like stress, but it can also be ritualized. So in that case, on the evenings of certain holy days, after ritual acts, the seer falls into book. Just like in this case, so sometimes people come to listen, like here at Kochek Dawood, there were 25 people came to listen to him falling into book, and it was very exciting. So it's a big deal in these villages when this happens. It's a very curious expression what they use for this trance, because most people here are not from Islamic studies. I will not go into details why they use the word defter instead of kitab. That's very interesting. I will just say that the word they use for book just refers to, historically refers to written document or record, very much used in administrative circles. But I found that in this region, sometimes it was also used for dream interpretation and magical activities. In any case, when I ask people, I ask seers, what do you mean by falling into books? So I really had a problem first understanding this. And usually they answer that it is the book, the defter, the document of Angel Fakhraddin. And Angel Fakhraddin is one of the 7 holy angels. And he's the one who is associated with the revelation of the oral hymns. So a source of spiritual knowledge. And as I mentioned, these hymns could not be written down. So there is a strong orality here, unlike with the case of Angel Sheikh who revealed a book. This is more an oral defter, so to speak. And I must mention that members of the Sheikh Hassan lineage cannot become seers because they already have a book or they have a pen. So there is no crossover. And when talking about defter or book in this way, what is emphasized is that this defter is a proof that Yezidis also have a religion of heavenly origin. So when they say, explain me, in defter, in book, I talk with someone who can be seen. What does this mean? It means our religion is heavenly. It is from the spiritual world. Defter is nothing else but heavenly knowledge. Do you know what defter is? No, it is not a physical book. Defter is pen, the pen of God. Whoever falls into defter is reading the defter, so the written document of God from page to page. So as you can see, book is in the center. So the concept of the book is in the center of the communication with the supernatural and of receiving revelation from the spiritual divine world. So to fall into book, what he said or did when he was in book, and even when they talk about speaking tongues, I already mentioned glossolalia, quite often that's referred to as to read tongues and not to speak tongues. So when I am in book, I read a tongue. Nobody understands this tongue. They don't know what language it is. I had a vision when I read tongues. I saw the word. It is as if a person went from this word to another word, as if my soul were flying. This is what defter is. Tongues is always book, defter. I mean falling into book, and reading, it is the same. When the seer falls into book, he speaks tongues, not Kurdish, but Turkish, Farsi, English. When he falls into book, he reads tongues, he reads defter, book. So there are other examples, which I don't have time now to bring up, that this whole trance of the seers is somehow associated with book and reading and writing, and also with school education. And I must mention that I had the impression it's very hard to prove that falling into book is something new. So it was not mentioned in connection with famous seers of the past. So negative evidence never quite works, but I had the impression that this is somehow connected with the spread of education, but I could be wrong. Just to finish it, because I think my time is up. So I mentioned that seers in Sinjar are quite different. They work with their jinn servants. However, even here, there is a certain amount of bookishness associated with their work, even though this is the last region to become educated. So my generation mostly doesn't read and write. So for one thing, these seers quite often create amulets, written or scribbled, I don't know. And people say that they do it exactly the same way like Muslim mullahs, which they also visit. So these are theoretically based on the traditional numerological calculations, name, birth date, so on, or so it seems. But what is really interesting is jinn writing, because some of these jinndar actually, so even though the jinn are supposed to be their servant, but also they were like in the power of the jinn. So it was jinn writing through their hands. And again, for those who read Arabic, this looks like Arabic, it is not. And the person I checked was literate again. So in this state, he was just writing, or the jinn were writing through him. And that's how I also created amulets. I also have one. And what's more, it's not just for creating amulets, it's also how they were doing the divination. So when people came with their problems and they were moving, the jinn were moving the pen in their hands, that's when they got the inspiration, or how they got the inspiration to answer the question. So to speak, through writing, they were inspired. So to sum it up, so the topic of Yezidi divination is, I think it's a very exciting topic in itself, but also I think that it really gains its special meaning only if we examine it in the wider context of an oral religion seeking legitimation in an environment that accepts only religions of the written book. So through their connection to the book, and through the spiritually inspired acts of reading and writing, the practitioners of various Yezidi divinatory traditions do not merely serve the individual needs of their clients, but they put Yezidi religion on equal footing with religions of written sacred books in the eyes of the Yezidi community. In fact, one may say that these practitioners prove that Yezidi religion is superior to other religions, as their books provide a continuous, constant source of revelation, unfinished and unbound, unlike the books of Bookish religions, which are finished. So in this context, divination becomes one of the strategies used to compensate for the lack of written sacred books in a bookish social environment. So thank you for your attention.